who the pharaoh was in that movie?
Yul Brynner.
Well, yeah, Yul Brynner, but the Egyptian pharaoh. Ramses. What they call Ramses the Great. Okay? Now, that's interesting. We know it's Hollywood. Hollywood doesn't exactly get a lot of history right. But during the 1950s, that was a pretty popular view, that Ramses was the pharaoh of the Exodus. All right? Now, we talked about last week how Howard Carter found King Tut in the 1920s. The 50s, of course, is about 3 decades later. All right? But this is the time period when evolution and all the science about evolution was really at its zenith. The 50s and 60s, all right, is where totally a lot of scientific endeavors were totally buying into evolution, all right? And so as such, they relied more on secular than biblical texts. And tonight, we are going to use the biblical texts, all right, just like the ancient or the first archaeologists did in the 1800s. We talked about this last week, all right? And we're going to let the Bible speak, and then we're going to see if there's anything to substantiate that, all right? Because the views of the Exodus have changed quite significantly over the last 30 years, and we're going to be talking about that today, all right? But before we get started, my joke for tonight. My joke for tonight actually came from you guys, all right? I got this at church, all right? So I'm not going to say who it was because if they don't want me to identify him, all right? But this is a kind of neat joke, and it kind of goes with what we're going to be talking about tonight. Did I tell you that I got invited to an archaeology party? They said they were just looking for a lower leg bone. It was quite the shindig. All right, so if you guys want to contribute to the archaeology jokes, feel free. All right. So what we're going to look at tonight is the Exodus. Now, like I said, there is no smoking guns in archaeology. There is no definite where we can say 100% sure this happened this way, okay? We got a lot of context clues, all right? And we've got a lot of things that have been uncovered over the last, like I said, 20 to 30 years, all right? So today we're going to look at a theory. Anybody tell me, to shout it out, what's a theory? You guys have all heard this before. Can somebody tell me what a theory is? It's kind of an educated guess, okay? Based off what you can see, right? And put together, all right? A theory cannot be proven, all right? If it's proven, then it becomes obviously a fact and no longer a theory, all right? So what we're going to do is look at the proposed theory for Exodus. Knowing what we have today, all right, is some of the context clues. Now, some of these that are being brought out, all right, I used a film from an archaeology team from 2000. That's the most recent one that did a lot of this excavations and looking into the Exodus. And we'll talk about why we haven't done anything more recently. We'll talk about that here in a second. So that's what we're going to look at today, is the proposed theory for Exodus. All right, I'm just going to go to the next slide. So let's take the Bible. Let's use the context clues from the Bible and talk about first, who is the Pharaoh of the Exodus? Is it Ramses? Okay. Or is it somebody different? All right. So we're in Exodus 1, 8 through 12. Now, a new king arose from Egypt who did not know Joseph. All right. I'm not going to go into the backstory. You guys all know the story of Joseph. He's in Egypt because of the famine. And he said to his people, this is the new Pharaoh, "Behold, the people of the sons of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal, all right, shrewdly with them. Otherwise, they will multiply, and in the event of war, they will also join those who hate us and fight against us and depart from the land." So they appointed taskmasters over them to oppress them with hard labor. And they built for Pharaoh storage cities, all right, Pithom and Ramses. Those two cities are key, all right, that we're going to see later, all right, because there's been digs in both of those cities. Okay, next slide. Nathan has to do my slides today because I didn't connect to the internet. Okay, now, who is the Pharaoh for the Exodus? Well, the Bible gives us some clues, okay? The Bible never tells us who the Pharaoh is. They just call him Pharaoh, all right? But in the Bible, it does give us some context clues about the time period, all right? So I'm going to read this, and then we're going to talk about time periods, especially in archaeology. All right, so if we go to 1 Kings 6:1, now it came about in the 480th year after the sons of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel. Okay, so Solomon now is king, all right? He's been reigning for 4 years, and he starts building the temple, okay? So let's do some math here. So let's go to the next slide. Now, it would be real easy if all of time from the beginning, Adam and Eve until now, was all chronological and everybody had the same calendar and everybody went by the same time. All right? That didn't happen. Okay? The world probably hasn't been on a universal calendar more than probably 500 or 600 years, depending on what time, what part of the world you're in. So when you're talking about an event that happened 3,500 years ago, all right, there's going to be some dispute, okay? Now, we've all read in the Bible, if you went through the genealogies in the Bible, okay? I mean, you've read the genealogies. How many of you have read about all the kings and stuff like that? Does it get really confusing? Okay, it does, all right? So if the Bible can be confusing, how do you think that the dynasties of Egypt that were around for close to 4,000 years now, do you think they had some discrepancies on their timelines as well? Okay, so it would be real easy if we could find out the exact date when the 4th year of Solomon's reign was, and then just go backwards and say, okay, then who was the Pharaoh at that time period? Voila, there's the Pharaoh. But it doesn't work that way, all right? Egyptologists, all right, are in dispute about the dynasties, about who reigned at what time, all right? And so that's why in the 1950s, they subscribed to what it was called the later Exodus. They believe that the Jews came to the land of Canaan 250 years before they actually did, okay? 250 years after they actually did, all right? And so that's why at the beginning, a lot of people believe that Ramses was the Pharaoh, okay? We're going to find out that timeline is probably wrong, all right? So we're going to have to look at a different Pharaoh, all right, for this time period. Now, two individuals that everybody pretty much unanimously agrees. They're both in the 19th century. We talked about the 19th century last week as being the century when archaeology first started to become a science, all right? And two individuals working at different parts of the world came to the same conclusions about the dynasties and the kings in the Bible, all right? I'm not going to get into the background of this, but Thiel and Koch both came up independently, all right, working. One was in India. They're both British, by the way, all right? One was working in India, one was working in Egypt, all right? And when they published their findings, they both found out that they were almost virtually the same. So most people agree that their timeline for the kings of Israel are correct, all right? So they both came up with the 4th year of Solomon's reign was 967 BC, okay? So if you go back 480 years, we should be able to see approximately when or who the Pharaoh was in Egypt. Now, that would put us about if everything was correct and time and the years were unanimously agreed to, that would be about 1466 BC. All right? Now, the Israelites wandered for 40 years, okay? So that would approximately put us at about 1426. Now, for ancient history, this is about as close as you're going to get. All right? So, who was the Pharaoh in Egypt about 1426 in Egypt? And it was Imhotep II. Now, he's part of the Thutmose dynasty, which is the 18th dynasty in Egyptian history. Thutmose III was his dad, all right? And we don't have time to go into the backstory of all this, but Thutmose extended the Egyptian kingdom to its biggest ever. So he was a warrior king, okay? And he passed that down to his son, all right, which we'll talk about here in a second, who was a mighty warrior, all right? So Imhotep reigned for about 26 years. We actually do have his mummy, all right? In fact, you've probably seen it before. We'll look at it here in a second. It's probably the most famous mummy. I mean, I had seen this mummy numerous times. I didn't even realize it was Imhotep II, all right? And we'll talk about why that's important. So we do have his mummy, okay? And so the approximate years, again, are about 1426. So for ancient history, that's probably as close as we're going to get, all right? Egyptian records could be off, all right, but it's in that time period, all right? So most historians today agree that Imhotep II was probably the Pharaoh of Genesis or Exodus. All right, so here is, go ahead and go to the next one. Here is the mummy of Imhotep, all right? And again, there's a bunch of these, of course, in Egypt, and this is one of the most famous pictures of mummies. It just happens to pop up a lot when you're looking at pharaohs, all right? But there's some distinctive things about Imhotep. So, again, as we talked about, there's no smoking gun in archaeology. We have to piece together some things, all right? There is about 10 reasons why Imhotep II is probably considered the pharaoh of the Exodus. And I'm going to go with probably the 3 most verifiable of those 10, okay? But there are a couple others that are interesting, that I'm going to bring up here just real quickly. All right, so this picture, you probably can't see it in great detail, but if you got up close to it, you'll see all the way from his neck, and they just show his neck to his head, all right? All the way from his neck to his head are boils, okay? We believe Imhotep died from some kind of disease that he had caught during his lifetime. Okay? Now, what do we know about the Exodus? Well, what happened before he allowed Moses to take the people out of Israel? Had to go through the plagues, right? Okay? So, we don't know for sure, obviously. We don't know exactly what this is. We know his body and his whole entire body is covered with these boils, by the way. All right? So we don't know exactly what it is, but it kind of gives you some context clues. All right? But that's not one of the ones I'm going to talk about. Okay? So he died from a disease, likely from maybe something that could have happened during the plagues. Another known fact: the son that Thutmose IV, all right, that took over after Imhotep II, was not his firstborn son. his firstborn son, all right, from his tomb, because they've excavated his tomb, all right, and there was some hieroglyphics about his son and his firstborn son. His firstborn son died somewhere between the age of 12 and 15. And he died suddenly, all right? So his next son became the next Pharaoh. Well, what was one of the plagues of Egypt? All right, so maybe a coincidence, maybe not, all right? But his firstborn son died. Now, there are two very early in history, Western history, there are two pretty famous historians that both had pinned down Imhotep II as the Pharaoh of the Exodus, all right? So Egyptian historian Mainthrow in the 3rd century BC, all right, from records that have now been lost, all right, there was an Egyptian historian who chronological all the dynasties of the Egyptian pharaohs, all right? That Egyptian historians' records were lost to time, all right? We don't have those today. We don't have those. But Manetho those records were still around when he wrote his first history, all right? And he's a Greek historian. So his manuscripts, supposedly he wrote them from that manuscript from the Egyptian historian. And he mentions that Imhotep II is the most likely candidate for Pharaoh of the Exodus. And then the Greek historian Charlemagne, all right, this is in the 1st century, so now we're talking pretty substantial amount of time, all right? He also, from the records from the Egyptian historian, also said that he thought Imhotep II was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. And from that manuscript, probably the most famous person that we know from early history was Josephus, all right? And Josephus quoted both of these guys and said that he agreed that Imhotep II was probably the Pharaoh of the Exodus, all right? Now, there are other things that point out to this. If you notice in 1 Kings, when we talked about they're quoting the Pharaoh about why they should enslave the Israelites, he insinuates that they might rise up against them because they're enemies. They might go against their enemies. Imhotep II, for most of his reign, was at war. All right? He was a physical specimen from what I can understand. He was really into sport. He actually led a lot of the campaigns himself. All right? And so he was kind of finishing up the wars that his father, Thutmose III, all right, who expanded the empire to its greatest heights. Greatest heights of the Egyptian empire, I don't know if you know this, but it extended clear in Libya all the way up to Asia Minor and in towards what would be Babylon. All right? So at one time, the Egyptian territory was pretty expansive. All right? And that occurred during his father's reign. So he had a lot of territory that he had to fight in. All right? He also had a very famous anger management issue. And he was very cruel to slaves. Okay? And we know this from the Egyptian hieroglyphics. So there's a lot of things about Imhotep II that point to him as being the Pharaoh, all right, of the Exodus. Again, there's no smoking gun here. So we don't know for sure, but a lot of the clues, and most people actually accept today that he was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. All right, if you came in here, you should have a map. So pull that map out. We're going to look at this map. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Nathan. There's two different maps here that are interesting. Okay? For most of the last 100 years, the map to the left is what was commonly accepted as the most likely path of the Exodus, if there was an Exodus. Because remember, many of the scientific community, archaeological community, does not even accept the Bible as true. Okay? So if there was an Exodus, all right, most likely they deemed that the first map was true. Now, what we're going to look at tonight is the second map. Now, this map was actually made in 2007, so it's fairly recent, all right? But it fits a lot of the historical and archaeological clues that we now have to put this theory together. So I wanted you to see both of them because we're going to look at them in how they came to the conclusion that they did, okay? So those are the two maps, and we'll refer back to those here in a second. All right, go to the next slide. All right, now, there's a whole backstory about royal families, rich people. Do they tend to have some problems with their families? There's a whole backstory that I found out about Hatshepsut, who actually was one of the few queen pharaohs. She actually was the wife of Thutmose III. Thutmose III died. Imhotep II was too young to become pharaoh. He was only like 6. So she ruled until he became pharaoh. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole story, but this is interesting, is that now from archaeological digs, we know that Hatshepsut tried to have an heir herself, all right? Apparently, Imhotep II was not her child, all right? That was not uncommon, all right, during the time period. So she wanted an heir from her, all right? And she could not get pregnant. So there's a story in Egyptology that she adopted a son. And he came to her from the Nile god. Now, again, coincidence maybe, all right? But you know the story of Moses. All right? So let's skip ahead a little bit. Why does Moses leave Egypt? You might remember. He killed the Egyptian, right? And by this time, Imhotep II was Pharaoh. First Kings had already happened, or Exodus had already happened. Exodus chapter 1. And so he fled. You might know where he went. Midian. Now, I was raised in a church. I, grew up on all the Bible stories and all that other kind of stuff. It wasn't until years later that I found this out. Does anybody know where Midian's at? No. I always thought Midian was on the Sinai Peninsula. Midian's in Arabia. Now, that is interesting for putting together this theory, okay? And we'll see this in a second, but there were only at the time period of the Exodus, there were only 3 roads out of Egypt to the east. One led directly to the land of Canaan, which was the top part. One led to the copper mines, which are in mid-Sinai Peninsula. And then the third actually led clear to the Arabian Peninsula, where Midian is. And there's probably pretty good conjecture that Moses used that road to go to Midian. And then 40 years later, when he came back and got the Israelites, they're going to use the same road. All right? And I'm getting ahead of myself, but all right? I do want to point that out to you. All right, so what's the destination? All right, so real quickly, let's go with the story. We're not going to have time to get into all this, but why does Moses go back? He's been in Midian for 40 years. He's got a wife. He's got kids. Why go back? God told him to, right? The whole burning bush. And where was that at? Mount Sinai. If we know where Mount Sinai is, we know that's where Moses is going to take the Israelites. Now, as you saw on the map, or look at your maps again, on the left-hand side map, real quickly, you might find where Mount Sinai is according to that map. You might see it real quick. It's on this map right here. Where did they put Horeb and Mount Sinai? At the tip of the Sinai Peninsula, right? Where's the second map put it at? Over here. Saudi Arabia. All right? So if we know where Mount Sinai is, that's going to lead us to a couple conclusions here. All right, so I'm going to show you, and that's a picture. Go back to the next slide, Nathan. Yeah. At the bottom, there's a picture of Mount Sinai. That's what it looks like today. All right, go ahead and hit the video, Nathan, and go ahead and make it full screen.
Moses married a Midianite woman, tended the flocks of his father-in-law Jethro, and lived in obscurity for 40 years, until the day he wandered to the base of Mount Sinai. There, God spoke through a burning bush and revealed his plan to free Israel from bondage. Given the biblical record, some believe that Mount Sinai must be in Midian. But is there any other evidence to support this theory? Several Jewish documents, some written 600 years before Christian traditions, locate the mountain of God in Midianite territory. In 250 BC, a council of 70 scholars translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek for the first time. Their translation of the Exodus account presupposed that Mount Sinai stood in the Arabian Peninsula. 3 centuries later, the Jewish philosopher Philo placed the mountain east of the Sinai Peninsula and south of Palestine. At the same time, the Apostle Paul, who was educated under the Rabbi Gamaliel, also located Mount Sinai in Arabia.
So Paul and Philo, when they use the word Arabia, they're not thinking of the Sinai Peninsula. Once again, I think that point needs to be emphasized very clearly. The terminology, Arabia, in the first century, Greek geographers usually have in mind the Arabian Peninsula. That's how that term is used.
Perhaps the most specific description of Mount Sinai's location can be traced to the first century historian Josephus. Moses married a Midianite woman.
Okay.
Tended the flocks of his...
Go ahead and hit stop. Okay, so from this little snippet, we get 3 independent, extra-biblical, well, one's biblical because it's Paul, all right, descriptions of Mount Sinai that were not in, all right, the peninsula, all right? It was in Arabia, the Sinai Peninsula, all right? So there is some evidence, extra-biblical evidence that Sinai was not, all right, where the first map says it is, which a lot of modern scholars still, even today, all right, think that Mount Sinai is. So there's a lot of, this is all speculation here because there's no conclusive evidence, although the guy in the video later, you're going to see that he thinks that academia is leaning towards Arabia. But it is still controversial, all right, of where Mount Sinai is. All right, Nathan, go to the next one.
Moses married a Midianite.
Sorry, I got to go to my next slide. Okay, so where did the Exodus take place? Now, if you look at the map on the left, the reason why many modern archaeologists believe that Mount Sinai is in the Sinai Peninsula is because of the biblical story itself. All right, now we're going to visit this here in a second, but obviously, what's the big story of the Exodus? What did God do that amazed everybody? He parted the sea. Okay? Is that a miracle? Okay? Is it beyond the laws of physics?
Yeah.
So, if you are an evolutionist, if you're an atheist, you're not going to subscribe to that. You're going to try to come up with a naturalistic, all right, theory on what happened. All right? So let's go to the next slide here, all right? And there's 5 traditional sites, all right, that over the last 100 years, they have decided what these are. All right, go ahead. I apologize, it's not going big.
As for you, lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, and go through the midst of the sea on dry land. The Exodus account states while on their journey to Mount Sinai, the children of Israel encountered a seemingly insurmountable obstacle, the waters of the Red Sea. Most searches for their crossing point have centered on 5 sites that straddle the eastern border of Egypt, as defined in ancient times. 3 of these sites are inland saltwater lakes: Manzala to the north, Timsah, and the Great Bitter Lake. Another location, the dry bed that was once Lake Bala, has also been considered. The 5th possibility is on the northern end of the Gulf of Suez, at a beach whimsically named on tourist maps as Pharaoh's Bath. 3,500 years ago, each of these bodies of water would have been relatively shallow, ranging in depths from about 3 to 50 feet. Not surprisingly, naturalistic explanations for the Israelites' crossing are common here, including a receding tide or strong wind that could have lowered water levels enough to allow for passage on foot. However, no direct evidence has ever emerged at any of these traditional sites to confirm the Exodus narrative. Nor did...
Okay, so modern archaeologists said that if the story is true, again, they always say if the story is true, all right, we have to have some kind of naturalistic explanation for this. So we're going to put it somewhere where there's a body of water, but how deep is it? Pretty shallow. What's the dramatic story about the crossing? Is God did what to the waters? And in the Bible, it says the waters were like a what? A wall. Okay? Again, we're just using the Bible for the context clues to see if this is true or not. So what modern archaeologists have done is they've moved, even though this evidence has been around for millennia, they've moved this and they said that it must have been a local, all right, crossing. Whereas, like, you have a wind or something like that, so the Israelites crossed over. Okay, so that's in direct contrast to what the biblical story is. Okay, and so that's why they have to put Mount Sinai in the Sinai Peninsula, all right, because that's where they think, if the story is true, that it most likely would have happened with naturalistic consequences. But what if it didn't? All right, go to the next slide. Okay, so like I said, there's an expedition, an international team that went into this area, and the guy who headed it, he's going to introduce himself here in a second, he is taking the Bible as literal, okay? And he says that the explanations that have been generated over the last 100 years do not fit the biblical narrative. Is there some place that does fit the biblical narrative? All right, Nathan, go ahead and hit it.
Well, I'm a scientist, so I try to analyze things and I try to go to the bottom with different issues. And the goal for this trip is to look at the Bible text as a book of history, a book of historical events, and that they describe something that really has happened. And then from the text, try to understand what really could have happened.
In the spring of 2000, Dr. Leonard Moeller took part in an expedition through Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula. Moeller is a medical research scientist at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, Sweden. He is also trained in the field of marine biology. His skills in analytical research, coupled with a deep interest in biblical archaeology, had drawn him to the Middle East on many occasions. Now, as a member of an international team organized by Discovery Media Productions, he had come to the Gulf of Aqaba to renew his search for evidence of the Israelites' Exodus journey. For several years, Moeller studied historical and documentary evidence suggesting Midian as the probable location of Mount Sinai. He realized that to reach the mountain of God, the Israelites would have first crossed a body of water located east of Egypt's ancient borders.
The land of Midian is always on the east coast of the Gulf of Aqaba. And the mountain was in the land of Midian. There Moses saw the burning bush, etc. So if the mountain is on the east coast of the Gulf of Aqaba, and if the land of Midian is there, and if all these events took place there, they have to cross some water to get there. And therefore, the Gulf of Aqaba is of great interest.
As the right arm of the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aqaba separates the Sinai and Arabian peninsulas. Moeller recognized several specific connections between the Gulf and biblical accounts of the Exodus. A prime example is found in the book of 1 Kings. In approximately 950 BC, King Solomon is said to have built his navy at Ezion-Geber, near Elath, an ancient city on the northern coast of the Gulf of Aqaba. According to the Hebrew text, this gulf where Solomon's ships were harbored was called Yam Suf.
Most likely we talk about the Red Sea as the Gulf of Aqaba. We know that it's called Yam Suf, which is the Red Sea. We know that King Solomon had his fleet in Yam Suf.
This Hebrew name, Yam Suf, also plays a prominent role in the Exodus account, for it is used to identify the waters crossed by Moses and his people. The geography of the Gulf of Aqaba also resembles biblical descriptions of the Yam Suf God once parted for Israel. Aqaba is extremely deep, plunging more than a mile in some spots. It is adjacent to a dense wilderness of rugged mountains. And it is located clearly outside the borders of Egypt, as recognized during the time of Moses. These similarities to the scriptures have led Leonard Moeller and others to theorize that the Gulf of Aqaba is the Red Sea of the Exodus story. And if they are correct, then two distinct possibilities for a crossing point exist. The first is located on the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula, at the Straits of Tiran. This channel, 5 miles across, is one of the most popular recreation areas on Earth, as spectacular reefs and marine life attract divers from throughout the world. But the topography of the seafloor here would have made an Israelite crossing highly unlikely. For less than a mile offshore, a subterranean canyon plunges nearly 1,000 feet at a grade so steep, passage on foot across jagged coral beds would have been virtually impossible, even if the waters were miraculously removed. 70 miles north of the straits, near the center of the Aqaba coast, another potential crossing site extends into the sea. It is called the Nuweiba Peninsula.
It sort of breaks out from the mountain ranges. I mean, there's nothing south of it and nothing north of it, if you follow the shores. Suddenly this peninsula just breaks out from the mountain range into a large plains.
This is probably the only place at the Gulf of Aqaba, the western shore, where you could gather as many people as the Bible states that they were. So,
Satellite photographs of the Nuweiba Peninsula clearly reveal its distinctive geography. This triangular-shaped beach would be the focus of a remarkable search for evidence of the Israelites' journey.
Okay, so the expedition, again, they're taking the Bible as true. And so they're looking for clues. Does the geography fit the biblical description? All right. And so this is where they focused on. A couple points here. The Red Sea divides into two around the Sinai Peninsula. The Suez part is where traditionally they thought if there's a fifth spot, remember there's 5 different spots, the archaeologists have not really confirmed if the Exodus was true where it was at, but probably the most likely they would have at least the amount of water that you could divide would be the Suez, and we're going to talk about that later. But it doesn't have the terrain that it talks about in the Bible. All right, this is the first evidence that we have of a big plain that could have held the whole nation of Israel as they cross the Red Sea. Now, the satellite photos, the drone stuff, all the new technologies that they're using now in archaeology have greatly aided this, all right? And we'll tell you why there hasn't been an expedition back to do further finds on this later. But, okay, so next slide, Nathan. Okay. Again, for time's sake, we're not going to go through the entire story. You guys have all heard this, all right? So if they did cross the Red Sea and God, well, we believe that God did create the crossing, what happened? Well, the Israelites, what happened to them? They made it. Who didn't?
You're right.
Okay. So what's the logical conclusion? They should be there. There should be some evidence if this is the right place, all right? Now, they've already done a expedition in the Suez, and divers have went in there. They did not find any archaeological evidence, all right? That was done in the 90s. This team comes in 2000, has known a lot of what happened. Now, and the reason why I chose this expedition, there is a lot of controversy. If you've ever heard of a guy by the name of Ron Wyatt, all right, he's a very controversial figure. I think he was on to a lot of different stuff, all right, but he doesn't have the credentials. He doesn't have the degrees and all this other kind of stuff. So when this expedition came about in 2000, led by a Christian, all right, it gives a little bit more validity, all right, especially to the academic world and to the science community as a whole, all right? And so that's why I chose that. There's a whole other sub-story about Ron Wyatt. He's a very interesting character, but he was referring to things that had happened before And he was referring to the expedition in the Suez, and then also Ron Wyatt, and then several amateur archaeologists during the 80s and 90s were also there. All right, so what happened to the Egyptian army? Now, I'm going to tell you, for me, this is the most controversial part of this, all right? As we see it here, just take it for what it's worth. I don't know a whole lot about coral, all right? So I did a little bit of research on this for this class, and I'm not totally convinced what we're going to see next is true, but it's interesting. So we're going to take a look at it.
When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country. For he said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. If the Israelites traveled from Goshen to the Aqaba coast, then the biblical description of their route to freedom is very specific. They walked a road through the Sinai desert in the direction of the Red Sea. During the time of the Exodus, 3 main roads existed in the Sinai. The way of the Philistines traced the Mediterranean coast past a series of Egyptian military outposts. Understandably, the Israelites did not follow this path. The way of Shur, an inland trail, terminated not on the shores of Yam Suf, but in the vast desert of southern Canaan. Only the southernmost road, a trade route that stretched from Egypt to the top of the Red Sea and then on to Midian, matched the biblical description.
It's a route that runs through more or less central Sinai from the Egyptian cities which are in the Nile Delta, and then on down to northwestern Arabia. This is a period when the incense route was beginning to develop. So we do have evidence of travel back and forth between Egypt and what we would call Midian.
Located above the peninsula's rugged mountain ranges, this trade route was well suited for travel, as its flat, hard-packed terrain made long journeys on foot manageable and commonplace. When Moses fled from Pharaoh after killing an Egyptian slave master, he would have followed this route to sanctuary in ancient Midian. Then, 40 years later, he led his people out of Egypt over this same desert road again. And the Lord was going before them in a pillar of cloud by day to lead them, and in a pillar of fire by night to give them light, that they might travel by day and night.
The Swedish Bible says clearly that they were traveling both day and night, and at night they had this pillar of fire leading them and enlightening them, and at day it was this cloud that I guess also overshadowed them because of the heat of the day, so they could travel both day and night.
By walking through the desert during the cooler hours of the early morning and night, the Israelites could have crossed the Sinai in approximately 3 weeks, the time allowed by the biblical record. The scriptures imply they had a significant head start on the Egyptian army, for many days passed before Pharaoh decided to bring Israel back into captivity. Then, while his army prepared to give chase, he received a surprising report of Moses' path through the wilderness. Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Tell the sons of Israel to turn back and camp before Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. For Pharaoh will say, they are wandering aimlessly in the land. The wilderness has shut them in."
And it says in the scripture that they turned. And That could be interpreted in different ways, but our understanding is that they turned southwards, and Pharaoh then was so certain about that they were trapped within the peninsula.
This satellite photograph defines the Israelites' unexpected change of course. They had entered a winding maze of dry riverbeds that branched off the southern trade road in a twisting path to the coast. And within this canyon, called Wadi Watir, Moses and his people were hemmed in between walls of rock 2,000 feet high.
Once you're into this wadi, you can't turn either left or right. You have to go, just follow it all the way.
You have huge mountains on each side, so you can't get anywhere else except follow this valley.
You can see the mountains are high and they're coming closer and closer, and the road is going, how do you say, back and forth between those mountains.
After walking 18 miles through the wadi, the Israelites caught their first glimpse of the mouth of the canyon and an even greater obstacle that now stood before them.
Suddenly, as you get through, after a long while, this big plain just opens up, into the Red Sea.
Okay, so that tells you what they think they could have taken through the deviation from the trading route. Again, it's all speculation. We don't know for sure if that's true, but it does put them where they think the crossing could have happened. Now, for time purposes, I'm going to skip the next section. So, Nathan, if you can just go to the next one. This is, again, what I think is the most controversial. He did some diving in that section of the Red Sea. And there's some unusual coral reefs there. And Ron Wyatt was the first one to do this. And he brought back supposedly samples, but they have never showed up. But he was the one that first saw these coral reefs, and they do look like they could be coral reefs will attach themselves to like wood, steel, iron, stuff like that, steel, iron, bronze. And so they do look like wheels, but it's really inconclusive. So the question is why, if these are true, if these are really this coral there is really the Egyptian chariots, why don't they just bring it up? Well, Saudi Arabia, because of the environmental laws, has protected the coral reefs in the Red Sea. You saw from the first, where they thought maybe the first crossing was at, and how they use that for like vacations and all that kind of stuff. So it's a big moneymaker, all right, for Saudi Arabia. And so they do not, it's kind of like the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. You can't take any coral from there either, all right? So it's protected. When they went down, he doesn't say this in the clips that I have, but he does say in the video that they could not touch the reefs, the coral down there, because of the laws and all that kind of stuff. They could only take pictures of it. All right. So, again, is it really chariots? I don't know. It's covered with coral, so we don't know. All right, go to the next one.
Account of an ocean divide.
Okay. Now I'm going to leave you with this, and then we'll do a wrap up because I'm going to get you out here by 7:30. All right. To me, this is pretty interesting. The dives are limited, and I'll give you the explanation of why there hasn't been an expedition back. Saudi Arabia has closed off the area. All right. They are not allowing anybody to go and do any archaeological digs in that section. Why? I don't know. But they haven't since this expedition, which was in 2000. All right. So You cannot go in there and do what these guys did today, all right? But they did, before they left, they can only do so much with diving suits, obviously. And so they used some modern technology to use these underwater mini devices. I don't know what they're called, but you're going to see it in the video. But they found something very interesting, all right, that again gives you, again, circumstantial evidence that this may have been where they crossed. All right, go ahead and hit it.
The discoveries made between Nueva Beach and Saudi Arabia have been fascinating, but they also raise some obvious questions. If God parted these waters, how could a large group of people, including the elderly and the very young, have walked across the Gulf of Aqaba?
And since we know that the Gulf of Aqaba is terribly deep, because there is a very deep section in the crust of the earth that goes from the Dead Sea through Gulf of Aqaba, down through the main part of the Red Sea, and down into Ethiopia, and it's called the Rift Valley there.
The imposing terrain of the Great Rift Valley is evident in the towering mountains that line the Aqaba coast. They drop straight down into the sea, creating an underwater canyon more than a mile deep, a seemingly impassable divide, even if devoid of water. While surveying the subsurface topography of the Nueva crossing site, evidence was uncovered that could help explain how Israel walked from one coast to the other. At its deepest points, the Gulf of Aqaba plunges more than 5,500 feet. Yet the ocean floor off the coast of Nueva Beach rises up several thousand feet from this trench, creating a wide, flattened ridge that the Israelites could have crossed once the Red Sea was divided. Simulated to scale in this computer animation, the view of the Gulf south of the Nueva Peninsula is striking. A chasm, deeper than the Grand Canyon, extends more than 50 miles. Its steep shorelines stand in sharp contrast to the shallow grade of the gently sloping ridge that extends from Nueva Beach to Saudi Arabia. It is a ridge that resembles what the Old Testament prophet Isaiah once called a pathway through the mighty waters. The robotic camera was used to evaluate the physical characteristics of this undersea ridge for the first time.
It's just flat, extremely flat, and very wide. There are no corals, there are no pieces of rock, and we followed that far out in the Gulf of Aqaba. It got deeper and deeper, but it was very flat all the time. And the interesting thing is also that the material on the seabed is not mud, as it is in the Gulf of Suez or at other places. It's a thin layer of sand or silt. It is easy to walk on it if you take away the water, and there will be no limit to have an enormous amount of people there, except the water, of course, but that's not our problem. God took care of that.
Okay, so to me, that's a pretty interesting caveat. There's this ridge there. So there's a big trench in the Gulf of Aqaba, but right where this beach is, there's a stretch across that's wide enough that the children of Israel could have crossed, and it wouldn't have been, deep if he took the water away. So to me, that's using modern technology and using the topography of the plain. There's one last video I was going to show you, but I'm not going to show it. So Nathan, just go to the next one. We're just going to, all it did was just wrap up what we're saying.
After more than a century.
So we talked last week, legal evidence, preponderance of the evidence. All right. We talked about how in our legal system, we convict people based off the evidence, but nobody is usually there to see it. Yeah, sometimes there's witnesses, but we have to make sure that the witnesses saw the correct stuff. And we talked about that last week. So I'm going to leave you with preponderance of the evidence. Does this for sure say this is where the Exodus was? No, I don't think conclusively you can say that. But there are some very interesting things that you can see from this video. And we didn't even get into a lot of the evidence for Mount Sinai as well. There's some really interesting evidence about Mount Sinai in the location in Saudi Arabia. They've done an excavation in a city that anciently was said that Mount Sinai was near its border. And they've done an archaeological dig in the 2010s. And it leads to evidence to suggest that that was the original Mount Sinai from Moses. So there's a lot of evidence there as well. So that's where we're going to end tonight. The Exodus, again, this is the way it's going to be throughout this series. We're going to present you with stuff that is from the archaeological record, but again, there's no conclusive proof. There's no 100% sure that this is happening, but a lot of exciting things are happening, and the use of modern technology is really opening us up. So we're done for tonight.